should we be elected later this year.
Thank you, Senator Birmingham. Senator Whish-Wilson.
Thank you, Acting Madam Deputy President. Great to focus on the benefits to the states and Commonwealth. Senator Birmingham, didn't hear much there about the risks to the states and the Commonwealth. Look, my journey to the Senate is actually very close to the bone on this topic of risks in assessments for large projects between states and the Commonwealth. My journey really began jumping a farmer's fence in Tasmania, going surfing, as we often do there, and talking to a few mates about a project that we'd heard about, that Gunns Limited were going to put a large pulp mill in the Tamar Valley and pump effluent into the ocean in Bass Strait, just exactly where we were going surfing. And it occurred to me from chatting to some of the guys that nobody really knew much about the project. So we'd wandered down to a place called Cow Head, we jumped in Bass Strait in frigid winter, and I started thinking about this. You know, what is this stuff that's going to go in the ocean, and how much of it's going to be going in the ocean, and where's it going to end up, and what's it going to do? Now, when I moved to Tasmania in 2003, I don't think I'd classify myself as an environmentalist, certainly not as an activist. And I went and met with Gunns Limited. I knocked on their door, I made a meeting, and I said to them, what's this business about you guys pumping stuff into the ocean? Anyway, it was probably too early then for them to give me any substantial detail. But the following 9 years was my journey to find out about the risks of this particular project. And as it turned out, and I'll get to this a bit later in the speech, the only body that was assessing the risks to the ocean and the ocean outfall was the federal body under EPBC law, because it didn't fall under state laws. The outfall was just further out to sea enough for it to fall under Commonwealth approval. 4 years I spent engaging in that process to get some scientific scrutiny on what this ocean outfall would do to a very special part of Bass Strait. And I'll get back to that in a minute, because it actually is really critical, and it's a really good example of why divulging powers to the states is not the right thing to do. But I also believe it's not just the right thing to do in terms of the environment and for communities. I also think for businesses, for profitability and for certainty, it's the right thing to do to keep a strong Commonwealth environmental law in place. So why are we here debating this bill today? What is it that's actually drawn us to this issue? Well, the answer is pretty simple. A big push by the business community to streamline, as Senator Birmingham was discussing, to streamline environmental approvals between states and the Commonwealth, quite simply to facilitate economic development. Now, there's nothing wrong with appropriate economic development, and I've got no issues with always searching for better efficiencies in systems and processes, but this system and process that we have in Australia between the states and the Commonwealth has been in place for a long time. A lot of work has gone into improving it, and it's not a stationary thing. There's thousands of people employed in this area. I've worked with some of the scientists at the University of Tasmania, for example, who have been doing cutting-edge research on looking at, for example, biological offsets under EPBC law. A lot of research is constantly going into this area to upgrade systems, checks and balances and protocols. So it's not as if the whole system hasn't changed. It's always a dynamic moving feast with a lot of good people. The Business Council's argument, or the central argument for rejecting the bill, is that it will inhibit long-term economic development of the Australian economy and therefore the broader well-being of the community. Now, that's fine if you see economic growth and profitability as being the same thing as the broader interests of the community. The business community, most of the business community these days, in my opinion, has moved beyond that assumption. That assumption is very much a last-century assumption. In fact, business profitability is closely linked to the health of communities, and the two can't operate without working together. They also argue that successful delivery of major capital projects is critically dependent on timely regulatory approvals and well-considered and well-managed regulatory conditions upon approval. If Australia takes too long to deliver approvals, or the conditions placed upon approvals are unworkable, major capital projects will not proceed or will not deliver full value to their owners or to the Australian community. Now, I think it's already been pointed out several times, including by my colleague, Senator Waters, that there is no evidence that, or no justification for these assumptions. In fact, the BCA themselves, the Business Council of Australia, even admitted that the data to support this was scant, but nevertheless they felt it was a reasonable basis to proceed with entirely changing our national laws on approving major projects. Now, the committee has heard, and we've had a lot of good evidence in the committee. I wasn't part of that committee, but I've managed to read some of the information there, that there is no empirical evidence to suggest that current EPBC approval process is hampering investment or imposing unreasonable costs on individual projects. In fact, some of the evidence was strongly opposing that and providing alternatives. Now, one submission which certainly caught my interest was by economists at large, who are partly commissioned by the Conservation Foundation to actually look into these assumptions of the business community of Business Council of Australia. They came up with the following broad conclusions. There is an inherent conflict of interest in furthering the powers of the state governments to approve projects from which they will derive revenue. State governments' desire for increased revenue may act as a disincentive to adequately assess the environmental and social costs of a particular project and to act on this assessment. I'd like to come back to that one in a second in relation to the pulp mill. There is limited empirical evidence to suggest that the current arrangement is hampering investment. The EPBC Act should be concerned with the effectiveness as much as it is concerned with efficiency. And by effective, that is the absolute key point in this submission by economists at large. It's not just about business efficiency here, it's about the effectiveness of these approvals. And effective means delivering social, environmental and business outcomes, and not just for the short term, over a long period of time. They also went on to conclude there is little empirical evidence that links removal of green tape with improved productivity and enhanced competition. Economic assessment of projects commissioned by project proponents need independent review, which state government planning departments are proving unable to provide. Federal and other independent reviews have shown serious flaws in economic assessments that have passed state approval. Diminishing federal powers would reduce opportunity for greater economic scrutiny of projects. Now, this is something that I can certainly attest to from my own personal experience. The largest commercial project proposed for Tasmania's history, the Gunns Limited pulp mill, started at about a $2 billion capex, but over time climbed significantly higher than that, was to be assessed by the Resource Planning and Development Commission in Tasmania, the RPDC. Now, that process took too long for Gunns Limited, and the company pulled out of the independent process. Within a few weeks, we had legislation before the Tasmanian Parliament, legislation to fast-track the assessment of this project. Now, we've since found out through evidence provided by members of the RPDC that Gunns was critically non-compliant in a number of key areas under the state assessment process. However, after what Don Wing, one of the longest-serving upper house members in Tasmania's history, said was one of the darkest periods of Tasmanian parliamentary history, this legislation was rammed through Parliament, through both the lower and the upper house. And I know because I was there lobbying as many people as I could myself to try and get them to see community concerns and not just take evidence from the proponents of this project. It was rammed through Parliament and it was passed into law. I and a couple of other landowners in the Tamar Valley then challenged this legislation in the Supreme Court and unfortunately were unsuccessful. The government even went to the extent to put privity clauses in place to prevent them ever having to provide reasons for the decisions that they made in relation to the biggest project in Tasmania's history. Now, that is a good example of a state government in bed with a large corporation driving a project that wasn't properly assessed. Now, the majority of assessment topics or points of assessment, such as air quality in the Tamar Valley, concerns the locals had with odour issues that are very common with pulp mills, particularly in a valley with an inversion layer, impacts, reputational impacts for the large and burgeoning wine industry in the area, which I was also part of, thousands of truck movements a day going in and out of this project, and numerous other concerns were not covered off by a state-based process. Now, nor were some of them covered off by the EPBC process because they didn't fall under federal environmental law. So that's something I think that's also been missed here. The EPBC has very strict conditions in relation to what it can and can't cover. Now, luckily for the people in the Tamar Valley and for my mates and I who surf in Bass Strait, the area that I mentioned was covered by EPBC law was the ocean outfall. Now, my surf rider group, and it's pretty hard to get surfers off their arse to do things, but we managed to get money and a group together to look into the scientific scrutiny of dumping 30 billion litres of industrial effluent a year, 4 kilometres offshore, downwind of our surf spot, 11 kilometres from seal colonies, in one of the most productive fisheries for a salmon in Tasmania. We scraped together money by one of my friends paddled a kayak from Byron Bay down to Hobart and raised $60,000, which we used to fund a research report. We got volunteer pulp mill experts from all around the world, South America, Canada. We worked our networks as hard as we possibly could. And we came up with a 68-page report, which we put to the RPDC, all based on some of the best scientists, including the Australian Maritime College, which did an entire chapter for us on the potential impact on marine species. This is all from people, volunteers, in their own time, with families, with jobs, with businesses, having to get this assessment done. Anyway, it went to the RPDC, and of course we never got a response because the RPDC process was cancelled. So we then went to the federal government. We met with Minister Peter Garrett in his office in Maroubra. We also met with him later in Canberra with, at that stage, the Shadow Caucus and a large number of people, and we lobbied really hard to get some work done on Bass Strait. And I would like to put on record that my group at this point had never said they opposed the pulp mill project. They simply wanted the risks to the ocean to be addressed. As it turned out, Minister Garrett agreed with us. The modelling that had been done had been based on absolutely no data collected in the field. And then Guns had to go away for the next 3 years and do the oceanographic studies that would show where this effluent, which included dioxins and furans, some of the most toxic substances known to man, and it took them 3 years to actually map how far this effluent would go. And at the end of the day, the project then ran into global financial crisis headwinds, and it's never got off the ground. We still to this day haven't got the evidence back as to what potential impact this would have. It's a really good example of why we need federal environmental laws, because we would not have got that assessed, just like all the other things that were never assessed. Now, I would like to argue that companies who just focus on efficiency rather than effectiveness think that's good for profitability. I would like to argue that's not the case. In fact, given any financier for a project or any company looking at corporate finance, whether it's a coal seam gas project, a new coal mine, a pulp mill, even forestry operations, fishing operations, any project has to have a return. Risk is always written into that return. This risk-return relationship is very familiar to most university students or even most finance students at school. So the higher the risk of the project, the higher the required return for it to get financed. In this day and age, in the information age where everything's online, where we have people, citizens empowered, being able to go onto social media, messages being relayed very quickly, blog sites everywhere discussing these things, information is the key to the future for environmental awareness and education. And it can't be ignored. No matter what project we look at now, it will be scrutinised. If not by state governments, if not by federal powers, the community will scrutinise these projects. I have absolutely seen it, and not just in the pulp mill, where 10, 15, 20,000 people marched, and hundreds of people I know gave up their lives and time to make sure everything was scrutinised. We even had an 8,000-page environmental impact statement that our group split up amongst 200 people. So everyone had to read a certain number of pages themselves and report back. If a community is motivated enough, they will scrutinise a project, and it is dangerous for companies to assume that they can go ahead with large projects without that type of scrutiny. And I would argue in the risk-return relationship that not addressing all the risks comprehensively up front is an enormous opportunity cost for companies, and it is an enormous risk for their future projects. Because if things go wrong, or the community aren't on side, social licences haven't been delivered, then my experience is that shareholders will walk away, and shareholders are very easy to lobby these days in the new age of technology. Shareholders will walk away, ethical investors will pull their money, and it's going to be very difficult for companies to operate in these environments. And externalities that are created by projects, if they're not assessed as well, eventually companies will end up having to pay for those externalities. And it is much better for investors to get that information up front before they proceed in a large project, no matter what it is. It is better for that information to come out up front in a comprehensive form before they proceed with the project. And as for an extra layer between federal and state assessments provide increasing inefficiencies in the process, which I also want to highlight again was disputed by the Senate inquiry as having no factual basis at all. If that is somehow a fillip to increasing sovereign risk of investing in Australia, I'd like to say with sovereign risk, go speak to Tom Albanese, the recently departed Rio Tinto CEO, and ask him about sovereign risk. We often hear this throwaway line that a carbon tax or a mining tax or federal approval processes are increasing sovereign risk and companies are going offshore. They're taking their money and they're taking their investment elsewhere, and this is impacting on jobs. What evidence is there of this occurring? Yeah, exactly. Look at what happened in Mozambique. Thank you, Senator. My point exactly. Look at Mozambique. It was going to be Rio Tinto's new big greenfields coal site, one of the biggest coal fields in the world. And look what happened. $14 billion in write-down. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. There's the exit. Tom Albanese, see you later. Just because we have an efficient system in this country for assessing environmental projects with a federal and state basis doesn't mean that we're high sovereign risk. I've got the smart money list here of countries and sovereign risk and political risk and country risk. I used to teach this to my students. Australia is in the top 10 and has been for a long time. Mozambique's about number 48 on a lot of different factors, so go and read it and then tell me that companies are going to leave this country, a stable political environment, English-speaking with long track records, and go and take their billions of dollars elsewhere. It's the number one argument that I hear from this side of the room, and it is rubbish. Absolute rubbish. Yes, they will diversify their portfolios. They'll always look for projects offshore to diversify their earnings. They need to do that from an exchange rate point of view. But the idea that they're somehow going to dump Australia is false. We need to maintain our federal environmental powers in balance with the state. That's why this bill needs to be supported.
Senator Whish